You. I now have the distinct honor and privilege to introduce our very special guests. First, we have Steve Kornacki, national political correspondent. Yeah! This almost feels like a rock concert. Steve Kornacki, NBC News and MSNBC. His work has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Roll Call, and the New York Times, amongst others. Red and Blue, the 1990s and the Birth of Political Tribalism is his first book. Please join me in welcoming Steve Kornacki. Not a problem. Please have a seat. Yeah. He will be joined by Carlos Lozada, nonfiction book critic of the Washington Post. He has also served as the Post's economic editor, national security editor, and Outlook editor. He received the 2015 National Books Critics Circle citation for excellence in reviewing. Please join me in welcoming Carlos Lozada.
I think that was my sister doing the only screaming for me. All right.
I like the strategy here.
Always be closing, yeah. So it's a pleasure to be here with Steve Kornacki and his rabid fan base to talk about The Red and the Blue. This is a book that basically tells us that whatever we don't like about politics today, we can blame on the 1990s. So I have some questions about the book and about politics writ large, and then we'll have time for audience Q&A. And I just want to start clarifying some basic themes and terms almost. So it's called The Red and the Blue, and you start taking us back to election night 2000 when we see the big map, right? Lots of red in the middle, lots of red in the south, lots of blue on the coasts, New Mexico kind of doing its thing. And of course, Florida, you people, up for grabs. So what did red and blue mean then versus what does it mean now to live or be part of red America versus blue America today?
Yeah, I mean, literally at the start of election night 2000, when people are turning on their televisions and they see the early states get called, they see Florida get called for Gore early on and they think Gore is going to be the next president, red and blue meant nothing to anybody. They were just colors. And they were randomly assigned colors. In 1984, for instance, ABC began its election night coverage, and they said, folks, we got a map tonight, Mondale and Reagan. We've decided we're going to make the Reagan states red because Reagan and red start with the same letter. That was the level of thought that went into these things. And you were just as likely to see a map that had the Democrats be assigned red and the Republicans be assigned blue. And it just so happened that the networks had synced up going into election 2000 with the same colors. So every network had, red for the Republicans, blue for the Democrats.
And that was deliberate. They had like colluded.
They had some. Well, there had been a lot of internal discussions, okay. And there'd been arguments, and there'd been claims that this was the wrong color scheme, and that you could make a case for. So there hadn't really been a lot of thought into it, and it just so happened they were on that. And then, as you say, we get something we hadn't seen at that point in a generation: a close presidential election. And so there was suspense, and then not just suspense, it was suspended for 36 days for the recount. And so the country was just left in the recount to stare at this map every day. And it was somewhere around then that David Letterman on his CBS late night show, he said, I got a solution to this whole recount impasse down there in Florida. Why don't we just let Al Gore be the president of those blue states and George W. Bush the red states? And so what it's become, I think, in the 20 years since, is basically, or 18 years since election 2000, they become stand-ins not just for the parties, but almost for cultures. And that's when I start using the term tribalism. I think the difference between red America, blue America, Democratic America, Republican America, it's not so much about this is what one side thinks about taxes and this is what one side thinks about, agriculture subsidies. It's a cultural separation between the two parties. And there's a distinct, almost like red America culture and blue America culture. And that is something that's new to our politics now, I think defines our politics.
When we look back on the 90s, it's easy to think about it as this kind of easy period, you know, the tech boom, economic growth, this kind of cultural almost complacency, right? Like Seinfeld's the top show, it's the show about nothing, you know? Bill Clinton's like playing the sax on Arsenio Hall, right? And, you know, it's supposed to be the end of history, right? Sort of American democracy and markets would just kind of triumph over everything. And so your book feels kind of countercultural almost in that sense, because for you, this was a period that sort of laid out these big divisions. Why do we sort of misremember the 1990s so badly?
Because I think the political stuff that I write about here was, I don't want to say it was beneath the surface, because it was there. If you were, you know, paying attention to politics back then, this was right in your face every day. But it wasn't as prominent as it is now. These are sort of the seeds in the ground, the sort of the roots, I think, kind of taking hold. But what you saw in the 1990s was just a series of political wars. And it was based on this collision of Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton. You know, Bill Clinton getting elected president in 1992, first Democrat in a dozen years to win a presidential race. It was supposed to be impossible. This was the conventional wisdom at the start of the 90s. Impossible for a Democrat to get elected president. The Republicans they called it the electoral lock on the presidency. Bill Clinton, I think it was James Carville, talked about picking the electoral college lock in 92. And Bill Clinton becomes president. And what he meets, though, is a Republican Party that was different. When Bill Clinton comes to Washington in January 93, the Republicans are the minority party in the House, they're the minority party in the Senate, but what's different is they've been changed by Newt Gingrich, who has been working sort of starting out in the back benches and working his way up. He's been changing the way Republicans think on Capitol Hill about congressional strategy. And the Gingrich strategic vision is that you nationalize politics, you don't compromise because compromising gives the other side credit and tells people there's no differences between the parties, and you look for vivid, dramatic, high-profile demonstrations of this is the difference between a Democrat and a Republican. He used to say the Democrats, he wanted people to think of the Democrats as the party of the welfare state, the Republicans as the party of the opportunity society. That's the contrast he wanted people seeing in every action that Bill Clinton took, every action that Republicans in Congress took. And it meant the beginning of political warfare throughout that decade that culminated, I think, in that election in 2000.
Newt Gingrich really is is key to the origin story of tribalism that you talk about in the book. And it's not just his opposition, as you say, to Clinton and the Democrats, but also it was pretty revolutionary for Republicans to operate that way. Where did that come from? How did this guy who, like, you know, lost his first few attempts to even become a member of Congress, how did he revolutionize that style of politics?
I always say, whatever you think of Newt Gingrich, because I know he's a somewhat controversial figure, the story of his rise in Congress, it's an amazing story, because he gets there on his third try in 1978. He's a history professor at West Georgia College. He gets elected to the House on his third try in 1978. And when he gets to Washington, the Republican Party in the House that he's joining has been the minority party at that point for a quarter century. And it's not even close. We just had an election where the Democrats are going to get control of the House now. They needed a gain of 23 seats on election day this year. It was totally within reach for them. We all knew for the last 2 years, whether they got there or not, it was doable for them. At least it was plausible. For the Republicans of the 1970s, the 1980s, even into the early 1990s, the idea of them being a majority party in the House someday, it seemed completely unfathomable. And that's what Newt Gingrich, they were, you know, well short of 200 seats. They were 100 seats in the minority. And Gingrich came to that Republican Party in January 79, and he said, I'm going to lead you to the majority. And they thought he was a nut. And what Gingrich sensed was that this country, at the start of the 70s, had just reelected Richard Nixon, Republican president, gave him 49 states, 61% of the vote. And he said, the country that's capable of giving Nixon 61%, the country that's capable of giving George McGovern no states except Massachusetts, if it's given that same choice between a Republican, pre-Watergate here, but a Republican like Richard Nixon and the silent majority, that idea, and a Democrat like George McGovern, this country will do nothing but vote Republican. So the Gingrich vision was to nationalize politics, was to make people see in every race in their backyard, every congressional race in their backyard, every race on their ballot, that kind of a choice, to see the Democrat as George McGovern, as a party of cultural liberalism, as a party of big and expansive government, as a party that wanted to raise taxes, that sort of thing. And that was that was a radical concept because there was political diversity in Congress at that point. There were liberal Republicans, there were conservative Democrats, liberal Democrats. You didn't have ideological cohesion. You didn't have these, the entire South was pretty much Democratic at that point, conservative Democratic. They were in alliance with, liberal machines from the North, Union Democrats from the North, and Charlie Rangel was in the same party as people who'd been, white supremacists in the 1960s. They shared the same party in Washington. And so Gingrich, he believed in sorting that out, defining the Republicans as a conservative party, and defining the Democrats essentially as a party of, George McGovern-style liberalism. That was the goal.
Now, seeing C-SPAN here reminds me of a part of your book that I loved, was of how Gingrich used C-SPAN in Congress to kind of nationalize his message. How did he do that?
Yeah, and so January 79, when Newt Gingrich comes to Congress, coincides with television cameras coming to Congress for the first time. So C-SPAN, cable television was just kind of, becoming a thing in the late 70s and explodes in the 1980s into everyone's household. And so part of this was Brian Lamb, who created C-SPAN, got the cable industry as sort of this goodwill gesture to the country to say, hey, you know what? With your cable package, you're going to get this channel, C-SPAN, where you get to watch your government every day. We're going to stick a camera in the house, and you can watch all the proceedings. And they convinced at that time it was Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House, to sign off on this and put the camera there. And most members of Congress thought nothing of it. Who's going to watch this channel? This is boring, blah, blah, blah. And Newt Gingrich recognized the camera had benefit because it could connect him to a whole new audience that he could otherwise not reach. As a freshman member of Congress, he was not going to get on CBS or NBC or ABC. He was not going to be on the front page of the New York Times. But he could go and talk on the floor of the House, and anybody who's flipping by C-SPAN might stop and listen. And what he found was there was an obscure provision in House rules that basically said, not obscure, but it was not really utilized. At the end of business on any given day, any member can claim the floor for as much time as they want for any reason they want. Special orders, they called it. So Gingrich and his band of about half a dozen allies began claiming these special orders. Typically, members would use these to read a message of congratulations to a local Little League team or a retiring school superintendent. Nobody, it's an empty chamber. They were essentially, Gingrich and his allies began producing what you would now recognize as a cable news show on the floor of the House. And anybody flipping through C-SPAN at 11 o'clock at night might find it. And they were railing against, the Democrats, the Democrat machine, as Gingrich would call it. They were railing against liberalism. The big themes here, big defining themes, the themes that Gingrich wanted to define politics. And they built a grassroots following. And that was the source of his power, a big source of his power in his rise in the House.
What that, of course, evokes today is the use of social media to communicate with a big national audience like that. How it's become almost a truism, right? That sort of silos in news media and the use of social media are forces behind the tribalism of the era. How important a factor do you see that, sort of shifting to today for a second? Is it cause or is it effect?
Yeah, I think there's a certain level that's always there, and it's a question of what kind of gets through the filters that exist in media. And that era that Gingrich sort of came to Washington during, the late 1970s, back then it was the big three: ABC, CBS, NBC. Those are your major sources of television news. No CNN, no MSNBC, no Fox News Channel, and your daily newspaper. And I think what that meant was it created on the surface a lot more consensus in our politics, because there's sort of this limited number of elite gatekeepers. They tended to know each other. They tended to know the players in the game. And there's sort of the terms of debate, the rules of conduct, they were all sort of recognized and understood by people. But it didn't mean that there weren't other forces and other sort of strains that were out there. But back then, you might find it in a John Birch Society newsletter. Somebody might run off a couple hundred copies of and send through the mail, that kind of thing. It began to change. And I think, again, you can connect Newt Gingrich's rise to C-SPAN and then cable news, and so that's the big change, I think, the innovation of the 80s and the 90s, and then the innovation really of the last decade or so, as you say, is social media. And I view it as a cause and effect, because it's this self-perpetuating thing where it brings things to the surface that have never been sort of part of the debate before, really, in a prominent way. But it also, in the process, kind of reveals that there was a bigger audience for it than that was always there that we just didn't realize.
Your other big, I mean, there are several characters, but it's sort of Newt Gingrich is one of the overriding forces in this book. The other is Bill Clinton, and he and Newt sort of faced off in all these sort of famous moments over the size of government and the budget and the government shutdown and getting a good seat on Air Force One and all these things. What is Clinton's role in the origins of tribalism?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Bill Clinton had to be able to win, Democrats had to be able to win a presidential election to set up the kind of clash we're talking about here. So Bill Clinton did the thing that as we say, was thought to be impossible for Democrats. I mean, Democrats weren't just losing presidential elections prior to 1992. They were getting blown out in ways we can't even conceive of today. Ronald Reagan beat Walter Mondale. He won 49 states in 1984. Michael Dukakis did better in 1988. He only lost 40. Jimmy Carter lost 44 in 1980. McGovern, 49 in 72. I mean, think about that. We have elections these days where it's a given at the start of every election the Democrats are going to win 20 states, the Republicans are going to win 20 states, and they're going to scramble over this vanishing number of swing states in the middle, and they each start out with 45%, and it's a question of who can excite their base the most. This was not what politics was like back then. So you needed a Democrat who could win a majority electoral college, and Bill Clinton could do that. So that's the first thing was he could win.
He did it as a centrist, right? Like sort of the Democrat.
He did. Well, he did it, and this is the most misunderstood thing about his rise, I think, and I get into this a little bit in the book. Is we think, okay, the Democratic Party had been pulled to the left by Mondale and Dukakis, and they wanted to move back to the middle, and he did in the general election run as a centrist. But to get the Democratic nomination, Bill Clinton put himself in a position, only Bill Clinton could do this, where Bill Clinton got to rally the old liberal guard of the party and be the last hope of liberals to stave off the conservative takeover represented by a man named Paul Tsongas. Paul Tsongas ended up being Bill Clinton's chief rival for the 1992 Democratic nomination. I think it's the biggest break Bill Clinton caught on his way to the White House was drawing Tsongas and not somebody like Mario Cuomo who didn't run as his opponent because Tsongas called himself a pro-business Democrat. Tsongas said, I want to be the best friend Wall Street ever had. Bill Clinton had been preparing to run for president under the assumption that he was going to be tagged a moderate, tagged a centrist, tagged a DLCer, which was the Democratic Leadership Council in the old sort of the liberal guard of the party didn't want anything to do with. And the Clinton folks spent a ton of time heading into that 92 campaign. How do we pull this off? How do you run from the middle in a Democratic primary? And when Cuomo decides not to run and Tsongas emerges as his chief rival, he doesn't have to run in the middle. He gets to say, Paul Tsongas is going to do giveaways to Wall Street. Paul Tsongas is a threat to Social Security, is a threat to Medicare. He got to run on all the old liberal ideas, knock off Tsongas, then move to the middle in the general election, and then get credit by history for returning the Democratic Party to the middle. But he never had to convince the Democratic electorate. He never had to convince liberal voters to opt for a centrist. He just had to get them to opt for a candidate who wasn't claiming to be Wall Street's best friend.
There are other figures in your book that I'd love for us to talk about. For so many people, the rise of Donald Trump in American politics today feels like completely unique. This kind of unexpected bolt of lightning out of nowhere. But you find some real sort of precursors to Trump in the 90s, basically in the protectionism of Ross Perot and the kind of cultural warrior of Pat Buchanan. What's the kind of the through line with these two figures toward Donald Trump today?
Yeah, I mean, this is an amazing part of the book to me, just in terms of the research of going back and finding this and recreating it and seeing that essentially at the end of the 1990s, Donald Trump, the man who's president of the United States right now, pretty much ran for president. He never announced his candidacy, but he did everything else. He pretty much ran for president, and his platform was saving the country from what we would now call Trumpism. And Trumpism in 1999 and early 2000, when Donald Trump was doing this, was embodied by Pat Buchanan. And Pat Buchanan, the Buchanan message might sound familiar. He talked about making America great again. He talked about ripping up unfair trade deals like NAFTA, reviving American manufacturing, giving the American worker a good deal again, building a wall along the southern border, and stopping the rapid change of American and Western culture that immigration represented by having a 5-year moratorium on all immigration. This was the Buchanan platform in the 1990s. And Buchanan ran in the 92 Republican primaries. he was taken as a protest candidate against George H.W. Bush, so people didn't read too much into it. He ran in 96. He won the New Hampshire primary, and there was this brief moment in 96 where the Republican Party had the same reckoning it had in 2016, and it said, the Republican leaders had to say, there's a bigger market for this in our party than we ever realized, but they were able to shut it down in 96. They were able to nominate Bob Dole. And in 1999, Buchanan was gearing up to run again. Here's another Trumpian twist. He declared the Republican process rigged, said he's leaving the Republican Party and he's going to run for the nomination of what was then the Reform Party, which Ross Perot had created in 1992 in his independent bid. The Reform Party was there. It had ballot access. You got an automatic pool of money if you ran federal matching funds. They were still a lot of money back then. And so Buchanan steps forward to run. And then in September 99, Donald Trump steps forward and says, this guy Buchanan, he's a racist. This guy Buchanan, hey, this is what Donald Trump is saying in public. He goes to Meet the Press and he says, this guy Buchanan, can you believe this? David Duke is out there saying nice things about him and he won't denounce him. This is, Trump takes a campaign trip. In Southern California, there's something called the Museum of Tolerance. Donald Trump takes a campaign trip to the Museum of Tolerance, goes on a tour of the museum, comes out and says, I really wish Pat Buchanan would come here. He might learn something. So this was the Trump campaign. Now, he was getting nowhere. This was the thing. There was this whole sub-debate in the fall of 99, early 2000. Is Donald Trump seriously running for president, or is this a publicity stunt? And he ends up backing out. What had happened was, to get the Reform Party nomination, you really needed to organize. This was going to be awarded by delegates at a national convention. You needed to line up delegates around the country. Buchanan was cleaning Trump's clock when it came to this. So Buchanan was going to get the nomination. And in February 2000, you can go back. This is an amazing piece of history to go back and look at now. In February of 2000, Donald Trump decides to end his campaign by writing an op-ed for the New York Times. In the op-ed of the New York Times, he talks about all of the people that Pat Buchanan has attracted to the Reform Party. And it includes David Duke, it includes a woman named Lenora Fulani, a few others. Folks, and Trump says, in this op-ed, I am simply not comfortable being associated politically with these people and can have no place in the Reform Party going forward. And then he says at the very end, he says, but I did enjoy the experience, and maybe someday I will run for president. And that was how he ended the op-ed.
And in that Meet the Press appearance, he referred to Buchanan supporters as wackos.
Right.
Right? Which is what years later John McCain would say, I believe, about
Wackadoodles, wasn't that the...
Wackadoodles,
yeah,
yes,
right.
yes, sorry, yeah. The terminology
I think they mean
gets
about
very
the same,
technical. Yeah. And so that was one of the amazing kind of moments. And because Trump isn't a huge character, but he kind of like rears his head once in a while, and it's a very different kind of Donald Trump. So tribalism isn't just about what politicians say and do, but it is in some ways a reflection of the impact and maybe failure of political parties. Mm-hmm. And so what was the role of the parties and party leadership in enabling the rise of these tribal forces? Especially today. I mean, it's the people who were on the stage a moment ago. We're talking about the transformation of the Republican Party into the party of Trump. So is there something in the sauce of the party, something that enables this sort of tribal behavior to rear its head?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this paradox basically where the parties simultaneously have both never been weaker and never been stronger. And I mean, the weakness of the Republican Party, just in terms of its power to determine outcomes in its own primary elections, was never more clear than in 2016. I mean, Donald Trump didn't get his first endorsement from a member of Congress until he started winning primaries. And the old logic, the old sort of assumption for how presidential nominations were determined, there was this political science concept about the invisible primary. And basically it was about candidates going around and collecting endorsements from influencers, elected officials, party leaders, interest group leaders, folks who had influence with primary voters, and that was how nominations were ultimately won. Well, Donald Trump was not getting those kinds of endorsements in 2015 and 2016. The Republican establishment, such as it was trying to stop him, and it was powerless to. So in that sense, that Republican Party establishment and the Democratic Party establishment, Bernie Sanders comes into the Democratic primaries, not even a Democrat, and gets 7 million votes. I mean, there was against, a candidate who the entire Democratic establishment had rallied around. So in that sense, I think they're weaker than they've ever been, and they are both, have the potential of being overtaken by forces that they don't necessarily want to be overtaken by. But they're stronger in that I think the sense of identity that people now invest in, I am part of Blue America, I am part of Red America, the cultural aspect of it, I think is stronger, is deeper, is more personal than it ever was before. And so people, and I think this is something you saw with Republicans in 2016, where Donald Trump got the nomination by he got 45% of the combined vote in the Republican primaries. 45% of Republicans who went out and voted in primaries actually voted for Donald Trump. But on election day, almost 90% of Republicans went out and voted for Donald Trump in the fall. And that's where that tribalism, I think, asserted itself, where it was, hey, ultimately, we don't want, Blue America taking over the country. We don't want Hillary taking over the country. And so ultimately, the Republican Party was there with Trump, top to bottom.
Now, there used to be this thing called conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, right? But we've reached a point where the political scientists who track these things and attitudes in Congress and such have found that there is no longer any point of overlap between the most liberal Republicans and the most conservative Democrats. Like in that Venn diagram, like there's no middle, there's nothing there, right? Having kind of wallowed in the origins of this separation, of this tribalism, do you imagine? I won't ask you for solutions, right? But do you imagine that center somehow being repopulated?
It's hard to see, and this is where I think that intersection, this is the thing that, I think the thing that Gingrich got right, just in terms of understanding where American politics was going, was understanding how much the media atmosphere was changing, how the number of platforms was exploding. This was even in the 80s and in the 90s when he was thinking this way, and how that was going to open up doors to nationalize these processes. And I think now, if you look where we are in 2018 going forward, our media is structured in a way, especially our social media, to throw the basic differences in your face every day, every second of every day. And I think in that atmosphere, it's hard for me to understand, hard for me to conceive of somebody getting traction in one of these parties' primaries by trying to run as the, sort of the centrist, alternative, as the idea of what Bill Clinton is sold as having done in 1992, which I said I don't think he'd fully ever had to do, but the idea of selling either one of the party bases right now on moderation, I think I sense among Democrats they accept it in the sense of like, hey, in this Southwest Pennsylvania district, we need to run a more moderate candidate. You get that level of pragmatism. But nationally, I'm skeptical that an appeal to the base is not going to be the most persuasive thing. And certainly on the Republican side, that's just been proven with Donald Trump in 2016.
One of the remarkable stories, I think, out of the recent midterm was that Newt Gingrich's old district, I think the 6th district in Georgia, was won by a Democrat.
Yeah, although it had been moved. That was the Democrats in Georgia in the early 90s tried to basically take out Gingrich with a redraw of the map.
A redrawing of the, okay.
And so they moved that district to the suburbs of Atlanta, because that was his base. He did well with sort of ex-urban rural voters with the cultural stuff. Then they moved him into the high-income suburbs of Atlanta and almost took him out in 1992.
And it was a sort of a Democrat running in part on a gun safety sort of platform, correct? Right. The sort of coming back to sort of more in the moment, and one of the big flashpoints in the midterms was the confirmation hearings over Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And you have all these moments that kind of embody political tribalism, and that seemed like a moment that when we look back on, when you write the book about this era, your sequel, I'm just imagining a sequel. I'm not committing him to the. I think people are going to be looking at that moment as very significant in sort of where you stood, on Brett Kavanaugh, on Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, seemed to hinge so much on a whole set of other political assumptions and your identity of red or blue. When you think about those hearings and you think about the gender and sexual politics of the 90s with Bill Clinton as well, what are the conclusions or lessons that you draw when you sort of look at those two eras?
Yeah, and this is where I wonder, and I was telling you backstage, with the name Mario Cuomo, why I feature him so prominently in the book and why I'm so interested in Mario Cuomo from a historical standpoint is if Mario Cuomo ran in '92, and he almost did, I think he might have beaten Bill Clinton in the Democratic primaries, and I think in a way that might have finished off Bill Clinton's political career. And people have gone broke betting on Bill Clinton to lose, so I recognize this could be a really foolish thing. But here's why I say that. It's because, remember when Bill Clinton ran in '92, the Jennifer Flowers scandal emerged, pretty early on in '92, and the assumption back then was that would finish him off, because it had finished off Gary Hart 4 years earlier. So Gary Hart had shown you can't survive an affair. Now here comes Bill Clinton, same thing's gonna happen. Bill Clinton managed to survive that. Mario Cuomo wasn't in the race. If Mario Cuomo got in the race, the Mario Cuomo who entered that race was already 30 points ahead of Bill Clinton. He would have gotten all the endorsements, a ton of the endorsements would have immediately come to Cuomo. This is before any scandal erupts with Bill Clinton. Money, all of the money that had been sitting on the sidelines would have come to Cuomo. He would have been the big front runner right away, and then the Jennifer Flowers scandal would have hit. And not only that, if you really remember, and this is in here too, the Jennifer Flowers scandal included tapes conversations of Bill Clinton and Jennifer Flowers on which Bill Clinton disparages Mario Cuomo as a mob boss, as mafioso. And Mario Cuomo, in real time in January '92, accused Bill Clinton of bigotry from those tapes. So I'm just imagining Bill Clinton running 30 points behind Mario Cuomo, being hit with the Jennifer Flowers scandal, and then having that tape emerge. I do think Mario Cuomo might have finished him off right then. And if that had happened, and you had a Cuomo presidency in the '90s, I think you would have had a lot of the turmoil, a lot of the political turmoil we had, a lot of the collision, Gingrich, but you would not have had, I don't believe, the sexual politics. I talk about red-blue being a culturally, the cultural divide around that. The reaction to how people processed the Lewinsky scandal in 1998, that informed the map that emerged in 2000. In 2016, when Donald Trump got hit with the Access Hollywood tape, 2 days later there was that debate. And what was his response? How's he going to handle this? He shows up at the debate with Bill Clinton's accusers. He shows up, and the message was always, hey, America, view this as a tribal thing. This is the blue America trying to take me out, and remember who blue America protected. That was essentially the message he was delivering. What if that had never happened in this country? What if we never had a president who tested that rule that Bill Clinton tested when he endured through the Jennifer Flowers scandal in '92? Because it didn't stop with Jennifer Flowers. 2 years later, when he was president, you had accusations of sexual harassment from Paula Jones. 4 years later, you had Monica Lewinsky. In Monica Lewinsky, we're still, as a country, processing that. I think in a lot of ways, we are reprocessing Monica Lewinsky 20 years later, and that whole episode, and rethinking how it was treated at the time. But I think it left a major, major mark on our politics. The more I read of history, just big picture history, this country, European history, global history, whatever, you just realize in societies where there's divisions, they will latch onto one side will latch onto the sense of injustice for a long time. And Republicans, Red America, have not forgotten the Clinton Wars in the 1990s, and that 20 years later, and Blue America hasn't either.
Trying to imagine the 1990s without the Clintons.
The last 25 years, maybe.
Yeah, it's sort of mind-blowing. Right, because so much of there were so many voters who were not necessarily in love with Donald Trump, but just couldn't fathom the idea of supporting Hillary Clinton. With that kind of counterfactual, I think we can start taking questions from the audience. There's a microphone here in the center for whoever wants to start us off.
So I don't know, is this on? Okay. Well, I'm a big fan of yours, and my question is, the country has gone through periods of time where it's been very polarized and less polarized. We're obviously in a very polarized time now, which you outline in your book, Red to Blue. How do you see it maybe getting out of this polarization and coming back together? Do you see any hope for that? Or what do you see in the crystal ball for the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, my crystal ball has not held up well the last few years, I can tell you that. But yeah, it's one of those, and if I had the answer to how can this all work out in in a better way kind of question. And I'd probably do something besides write a book, 'cause, I could probably solve a lot of the problems of the world. It was one of the things that I was, as I was researching this book, as I was writing it, I wanted to have that chapter I could end it on, or that note I could end it on, that looks forward and says, here's the better place I think it could end up going, or here's how we could potentially get there. And I don't have a good answer to it, except that I do think there's an argument to be made. If you want to take a hopeful note from it, the way I kind of look at it was human nature, in a way, has got us into this sort of tribalized mess. We are, I think, as human beings, to a certain degree, hardwired to think tribally. And I think it's just the way media has evolved in particular, the way our politics has evolved with the changes in media over the last generation or two, I think have really tapped into that sort of innate human tribalism. But maybe there's an aspect of human nature that also gets sick of this and looks for something better. And maybe in some way, 20 years from now, we look back and we look at this period of our politics as an ugly but ultimately necessary bridge to something better.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm a big fan. But coming from MSNBC, this might seem an odd question, but I'm wondering if you can address what you think Fox News' effect is on tribalism.
Well, look, Fox is the origin story of Fox, which was created in 1996. Cable news is created in 1980 with CNN, the cable news network. It's the first time you have 24-hour cable news. And CNN, adheres to they basically take the network television, the broadcast network television model, and apply it to cable news for all those years. And they get traction in the early 90s with the Gulf War. They become, an established part. The Fox News origin story was seeing CNN, that CNN had tapped into, there was a market out there, some market for cable news, but also seeing the success of Rush Limbaugh. And Rush Limbaugh, obviously, big-time conservative radio host, his big break came in 1988. In 1988, Rush Limbaugh's show went nationally syndicated, and almost overnight, he had 10, 15, 20 million listeners a week. And Rush Limbaugh in the late 80s and early 90s was an absolute sensation. And in fact, Rush Limbaugh and Newt Gingrich, in a lot of ways, were working in tandem in that period, where, Newt was sort of on Capitol Hill touting a message, and Rush was amplifying it on the radio. And Rush became such a phenomenon that, okay, let's do a TV show. And the producer of the TV show, this is in the early 1990s, was Roger Ailes. So Roger Ailes took this talk radio phenomenon, brought it to television. He had a nightly syndicated Rush Limbaugh show. I think it was a half-an-hour show for about 4 or 5 years in the early 1990s. And you had this model of CNN that had been created in 1980. And I think Ailes put all those things together and said, you know what? There is a huge market out there. There's a huge market of people who are interested in political news, who are interested in political current events, and they're hostile to CNN, NBC, ABC, all of the sort of what you call the mainstream broadcast outlets. So there's a market there for a cable news channel that serves that audience. And that was Roger Ailes then in 1996 who created the Fox News channel with the slogan, fair and balanced. And it was telling that audience that was very into politics and current events, that had a very low opinion of the mainstream media, we're different. And that was the start of it. And MSNBC was also created in 1996, although the MSNBC of that era, you probably wouldn't recognize today. It took I'd say, a decade before MSNBC started to find its the identity that you would now associate with MSNBC.
Thank you for your talk. I've been thinking about this political shift from a cultural perspective deeply, and it seems to me that in this country, for a long period of time, you talked about the sexual politics, also a candidate's religion, or those deeply personal things didn't seem as important even 200 years ago in this country. And so somehow we've come to a point where these things about a person that they cannot change, their ethnicity, well, you could change your religion, but like the things that are like deeply personal that weren't part of the the political narrative initially in this country have seemed to taken over. And I'll leave it up to you to either talk about that, like you know, the previous centuries, as opposed to like the last 50 years that we heard about in this talk, and I would like to know whether that you go into that deeper in your book, or where we're going with the technological advancements in the future, because it seems like the key point that I got from your talk, and what I've found as well, is the Republicans kind of hijacking television and taking, you know, politics, you know, to TV in a way that had never been done before, and that was a key shift. Where do you see us going with technological advancements in the future?
Yeah, I just in terms of like using television and using the exploding media landscape to nationalize politics. Newt Gingrich, I think, was the one who saw the opportunity in that first, and who did more to move our politics in that direction, I think, than anybody. But I'm also pretty convinced it was an inevitable process. It was going to eventually happen. Somebody was gonna figure that out. I think it happened. It was Newt Gingrich. So I think that's the origin of it. But I think we're now at a place, you know, if that was Newt Gingrich in the late 70s and you fast forward 40 years to where we are today, I think we're now in a place where both parties have created their own, both sides, blue and red America, have created their own media ecosystems. And again, that's why I think it's who plays the arbiter's role in this anymore. You know, I think that's sort of the question. And that's why when I was saying, you know, is there room for something in the middle there? That's why I start to get skeptical, because I think you have these almost self-reinforcing blue America media ecosystem, self-reinforcing red America media ecosystem, and increasing distance between them. So that's where I see it right now, and that's where I see it going for the next few years. And again, just with this not very well thought out hope that we all kind of come up with a better way.
Hi, so my question has more to do with your work than your book. You go into a lot of polling details on MSNBC. Everyone loves to know what's going on with the polls. But due to the nature in which people conduct polls, where you physically call someone and you have to answer them and ask them what their opinion is, it's increasingly underrepresenting young people and people of color who either don't pick up their phones or don't have a phone to answer, and overrepresenting older people and white people. Considering what happened in 2016 with how people got really upset with pollsters and the results, as someone who explains polls, how do you think people should start taking these very specialized results and generalizing them for like the entire public?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, the best piece of advice with polls is always take them, you know, with a grain of salt. I actually do. I'll speak up for the polls here, though. I think they were pretty good this year, and I don't think they were that bad in 2016. What they actually missed in 2016, to me, the story of the polling missed in 2016 was not the national poll. As we, you know, our final NBC News national poll in 2016 found Hillary Clinton running 4 points ahead of Donald Trump. You know, she won the national popular vote by almost 3 points. So our national poll, I think was about right, and that's where most of the national polls were at the end. What was missed in 2016 was that surge of support that Trump got, really in rural areas, ex-urban areas, from, I think it did tend to be white voters, older white voters, in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, places like that. We were looking all in the fall of 2016 for, I knew what the path to victory would be for Trump if he was going to get it, and it was going to be the Rust Belt. And we were looking every time there was a Wisconsin poll out there, is this going to be the poll that has Trump within a point, within 2 points, ahead, something like that. Never got that. He was down 6 in the polling there right to the end. So that was the miss, and the way that miss has been explained to me was that this division among white voters of, it's a social class decision, but it's the red-blue America division among white voters, college-educated, non-college educated. There have been differences there, growing differences through the years, but in 2016 they just exploded. And so suddenly it mattered very much in your poll, not just if you were getting the right share of white voters in your poll, but were you getting the right share of non-college white and college white in your poll? Because if you were getting too many of the college white, you were getting too many of the what were becoming blue America suburbanites who didn't like Donald Trump. And if you weren't getting enough non-college white, you weren't getting what Trump had in the exurbs in the rural areas. And I think that's what the miss was back then. But I think, to be honest, I don't swear by the polls because the cliche is the only poll that counts is on election day. But my defense of polls, just as in terms of using them so much, is every campaign in the country is using them. The national parties are using them, making hugely critical decisions about their resources, about where they focus their attention, where they don't focus their attention, what kinds of messages they use, what kinds of policies they pursue, what kinds of policies they oppose. They are using polls for all of that. So my view is just let's let the public see as much of that as they can, because the parties are seeing it too.
I have a really short second question. Sorry.
You just mentioned the Rust Belt, and I'm thinking a lot. I think the Democratic primary just started on November 7th, 2018. And so will a Kamala or somebody like Bernie, maybe even Beto, be able to win the Rust Belt in a general election? And do you think, how do the moderates, who I don't think the momentum is going for the moderates right now, but how would a Biden or like a John Hickenlooper win the 2020 nomination? And what would the general election look like depending on which kind of faction won?
Youth vote. No way, yeah.
There it is.
Right there.
I mean, yeah, you said it began on November 7th. The actual first announced candidacy was a year earlier. This congressman from Maryland, John Delaney, has actually been running for a year now, running ads in Iowa. So I saw there's a story about him the other day. His name recognition in Iowa is over 50%. I don't know if he has that in his own congressional district, but it's amazing. So yeah, it's already underway. And I assume this Democratic field that emerges will compete with the Republican field of 2016, just in terms of sheer size. And of course, in the age of Trump, we all live with that. Well, if Donald Trump could do it, then why can't so and so do it? So it's tough for me to say. But you mentioned the Rust Belt. If Joe Biden runs, I think that's essentially his campaign message. 77,000 votes across 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. You lost him with Hillary, you'll win him with me. I think that's essentially going to be the Biden message if he runs. It's a more complicated question when you talk about, now somebody like Beto O'Rourke is interesting. It's interesting to me, first of all, that we're having a conversation about somebody who just lost a statewide race, potentially running for president, which is done before with Abraham Lincoln, but I don't know if we want to put Beto O'Rourke and Abraham Lincoln in the same. But
You just did.
Yeah. I did, and then I immediately doubted it. But when you look at what happened in Texas, he lost in Texas, but he got close. Where was the energy for Beto O'Rourke? It was those suburbs. Suburbs, Dallas, Austin, Houston. Huge interest he generated. Huge turnout. Now, it wasn't enough to offset the sort of Republicanness of Texas, but it was enough to get awfully close. And you start looking at a candidate like that, maybe it's O'Rourke, maybe it's somebody else who has a similar effect, but the idea to me then becomes, well, are there opportunities there for Democrats besides those 77,000 votes across 3 Rust Belt states? Are there opportunities in Georgia? Are there opportunities even in Texas? Certainly, there are clearly opportunities for them in Arizona, where they just won the Senate race. So, we always have that tendency to use the electoral map from the last election as the reference point for the next one. But watching his performance in Texas in particular told me there are some growth areas that Democrats may be able to hit in 2020. And in fact, you could also look at this year's election results and say, okay, the Democrats did win, Michigan, they did win Pennsylvania pretty easily, and they did get Tammy Baldwin reelected in Wisconsin. But you look at some of those, Debbie Stabenow in Michigan won by 6 points, for a race that did not get, she's won bigger before, did not get a lot of attention, did not have a Republican opponent who was lighting the world on fire. It told me that there's still enough give there for Democrats to win in Michigan, but a lot of that Trump area, not all of it, but a lot of it I think is now consolidated there into the sort of Republican, anti-blue America, bloc. And Michigan might be a tough lift for Democrats in 2020 with Trump running again. And it may be that they start looking to Arizona and Georgia and those places as having more potential because of those suburbs.
Well, please join me in thanking Steve Kornacki and Carlos Lozada. Thank you.
This is great. Thank you.
Steve Kornacki will be in the book signing area to the right of the elevator. Thank you.
I heard too, yes.
It's great. Thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah, certainly. Now the moment of truth, right? Can we convert it?
About 15, 20 minutes, you're going to hear from Ben Rhodes, Dan Pfeiffer, and Bill